All right. Good evening and welcome, everybody. My name is Emily Garfinkel, and I am the Membership and Programs Manager with the Connecticut League of History Organizations. For those of you who are not familiar with us, we are a small nonprofit who serves to build connections among those who preserve and share the stories and objects of our past. Since 1950, we have strengthened and sustained our members by sharing knowledge and experience and promoting the best practices among museums, historical societies, libraries, and all of those who steward Connecticut's heritage collections. We are a membership-based organization, and we work hard to provide resources for organizations and individuals across Connecticut. And it is my absolute pleasure to present this program, Lights Out for Benedict Arnold, hosted by the Norwich Historical Society, along with our fantastic panel of scholars who we have as well. Just some quick housekeeping. As mentioned, this program will be recorded and it will be available afterwards. So if you do want to pass it along to your friends or colleagues, it will be accessible this evening. And if you have any questions that come up during the presentation, we do ask that you use the chat function in the Zoom. You can drop your questions in the chat, and we will stop the presentation around 10 minutes before. So around 6:50, it will be open Q&A, and our scholars will be more than happy to go through and try to answer those questions at the end. So if anything comes up, you can just drop them in the chat. And without further ado, I will pass this over to Regan Miner, the Executive Director of the Norwich Historical Society. And thank you all once again for joining us this evening, and take it away, Regan.
Thank you so much, Emily, and thank you so much to CLHO for partnering with us on this event. We're so grateful to have great partners like you guys, so thank you so much. So welcome all. For those that don't know me, my name is Regan Miner, and I'm the Executive Director of the Norwich Historical Society, and I'm so pleased to welcome you to our program, Lights Out for Benedict Arnold, a panel discussion. I would first like to pay tribute to the Mohegan tribe, who are the original stewards of the land where the city of Norwich now stands. The Norwich Historical Society's mission is to preserve, protect, and promote the rich history of Norwich, Connecticut. And I would encourage all to consider supporting the Norwich Historical Society by donating or becoming a member. So why are we here today? Benedict Arnold was born on January 14th, 1741 in Norwich, Connecticut. Benedict Arnold's name is synonymous with the word traitor. However, despite Arnold's defection to the British, he was a fierce patriot for the Continental Army, and there are two sides to Benedict Arnold, patriot and traitor, yet it is often difficult to reconcile both aspects of his complex profile. So over the past few years, the Norwich Historical Society has taken steps to acknowledge our infamous native son by creating the self-guided walking tour called the Benedict Arnold Trail, which highlights Arnold's upbringing in Norwich. In addition, we host events such as this panel discussion around Arnold's birthday in January. So this year, NHS, in partnership with the Norwich Arts Center and the City of Norwich, coordinated 3 events acknowledging our infamous native son's birthday. Our first event will be this panel discussion tonight. The proceedings will culminate tomorrow with a series of events where the City of Norwich will turn off the City Hall Christmas lights in a tongue-in-cheek acknowledgement of Arnold's birthday, hence the term Lights Out for Benedict Arnold. And I'd like to give a special thank you to our sponsors, Chelsea Groton Bank, Connecticut Humanities, and Charter Oak Federal Credit Union, for sponsoring these events. So tonight, I'm thrilled to introduce my colleagues and friends for a panel discussion on Benedict Arnold. We'll talk a little bit about their individual research on Arnold, and then, of course, discuss his treachery. So our featured panelists include Brian Carso, who is the Associate Professor of History and Government at Misericordia University. Then we have Arthur B. Cohen, who is the affiliated scholar of the Institute of Nautical Archaeology at Texas A&M. And last but certainly not least, we have Joyce Lee Malcolm, who is the Professor Emerita of Law at the Antonin Scalia Law School at George Mason University and the Patrick Henry Chair of Law in the Second Amendment. So I'll be asking them a series of questions, and we'll take turns allowing each speaker to answer the questions. And as Emily noted earlier, if you have any questions for the scholars at the end of the program, just please put them in the chat and we'll get to them later. So are you guys ready to begin? Brian, Art, and Joyce? All right. So the first question I have here is just to please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more about your professional background. And so Brian, just because you're on my screen first, I'll start with you. Oh, you're muted, my friend. Hang on, Brian, you gotta take yourself off mute.
There we go. Let's start
There.
with learning how to use the computer. All right, terrific. Let me thank Emily and Regan very much for the great work you do, and it's a delight to be on the panel with Joyce and Art, two fantastic scholars. I also just want to thank Regan, Bill Champagne, who I saw is on here, and Bob Reed. Bob gave me this picture, and I think 2015, which, if I remember correctly, Bill Stanley, a Norwich resident, had commissioned. And it inspired me while I was writing my most recent book, which I'll tell you about. But I pulled it off the wall and put it behind us here for inspiration. So I'm an associate professor of history and government at Misericordia University, which is a college near Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. I've been there for 17 years. My background, I was a lawyer for a number of years, and I decided to become a historian, and went and got a PhD in American Studies at Boston University. And I was interested in legal history, and I'll talk about this perhaps a little bit more later, but I had written a law review note about the treason clause in the Constitution in law school. And so when I got to studying history, I was still interested in this idea about treason. So I wrote a dissertation that later became a book about it's called Whom Can We Trust Now? The Meaning of Treason in the United States from the Revolution through the Civil War. So, looking at not just a legal history, what did treason mean in a courtroom, but what did it mean in culture as well? And of course, there's a chapter on Benedict Arnold in there. So that led me to, I read about a little known episode when Arnold betrayed Washington and the Patriot cause at West Point. Within a week, George Washington had an idea to capture Benedict Arnold. Of course, they had captured John Andre, and soon thereafter he was found guilty of espionage and hanged. But Washington really wanted to get Arnold. He was the main perpetrator. He had escaped to New York and was with the British. And Arnold put out a plea to Continental Army soldiers to desert from the Continental Army and join Arnold's American Legion that would fight for the British. And Washington said, well, let's take advantage of this. Let's send somebody, let's feign a desertion and send a sergeant major from Henry Lee's Corps to Manhattan. And let's have him get close to Arnold. And then he'll be in contact with Washington's spies, and they'll figure out where they're going to grab Arnold. There'll be a boat on the side of the Hudson River ready to row him across to New Jersey, where Lee's dragoons will be ready to take him to wherever he needed to be tried and hanged. And I thought, well, naturally, there's not a lot of information about this because it was a secret mission. But on the other hand, so I thought, well, it could either make a cool, short academic article or a much cooler historical novel. So so I've written a historical novel. It's called Gideon's Revolution. It's coming out in September of this year of 23, being published by Three Hills, which is an imprint of Cornell University Press. And I realized I started that novel with a tour of Norwich in, I think it was August 2015, that Regan and Bill and Bob was there. And I stayed overnight for a couple nights in the Lathrop House, which is where we're cousins of the Arnold family. And Arnold did an apprenticeship with the Lathrops. And I started the novel actually in a room upstairs in that house where I sort of imagined the young teenage Benedict Arnold walking up and down the hall in the night. So Norwich has a special place in my heart. Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much, Brian. So I'll just go where you guys are on my screen. So Art, you're next on my screen. And so same question, just introduce yourself and tell us a little about your professional background.
Well, my name is Art Cohn. I live in Vermont. Like the other panelists, I think we're all guilty of being trained as lawyers. I was a criminal lawyer for a short time who escaped to become a professional diver. In the pursuit of that profession, I became a nautical archaeologist, and as a nautical archaeologist focused particularly on Lake Champlain, I had the accidental but good fortune of discovering after the fact that Lake Champlain had had an extraordinary Revolutionary War and linear history, and that some of that history was still contained within Lake Champlain and could be found and studied and add to our understanding of the historic record. It's my observation that if you take the lens of history and you add the lens of archaeology and you put those two lenses together, you get a time machine-like view of what actually happened. And so I was working in a place called Arnold's Bay on Lake Champlain, named for a very brief, about a 2-hour episode where Benedict Arnold was retreating and escaping from the Battle of Valcour Island in October of 1776. We were trying to document what might still be there underwater as evidence of the events of that day and compare it to historical accounts. And in the course of that research, both in the water and then through the archives, I became aware that there was an open controversy about Benedict Arnold, which said that he had burned his sick and wounded men on the boats, the 5 boats that he was abandoning so that they wouldn't get into British hands. He was destroying them and blew them up. But the dreadful account that survived that event was that he had burned his sick and wounded men in the vessels. As a researcher, as a criminal lawyer, I was fascinated with the evidence, did my own research, tried to add to it, and came to the conclusion that Arnold was completely innocent of the charge, that it was the classic, after the treason, everything he did was viewed through a lens of distrust and disfavor, but in fact, he had acted quite nobly in Arnold's Bay in 1776. And I wrote about that for an article in Vermont History and became at that point one of Arnold's greatest champions and defenders, which I did for about 25 years. Then I was through the good offices of the William Clements Library at the University of Michigan, I was given 2 fellowships to study Revolutionary War documents. This was in 2015 and 16. It was something of a revelation to me. It was one of the great experiences of my life. I recommend the Clements Library for any researcher on the topic. And I will tell you, I finished that process having a different viewpoint. I now see Arnold as a much more dark and sober character whose treason was quite extraordinary. The Clements has all the negotiation, the original papers of that written negotiation between Arnold and the British. And so I've walked on both sides of that road, and I'm trying to finish up a study of Benedict Arnold, the treason at West Point, and how perhaps he really was. I'll stop right there. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Art. And then Joyce, same question. Just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your professional background.
Well, I am not a lawyer. I am a historian who has ended up teaching lawyers. So I've sort of started from a different point of view.
Yes.
My special area is early modern British and American history. So that's sort of 16th, 17th, 18th century history. Particularly interested in the Constitution, individual rights, the history of war. And my earlier books were really much more on sort of specifically constitutional issues on the Second Amendment. But I got interested through actually a project I did for the National Park Service in a document of the sale of a slave boy in Massachusetts in 1765 at the age of a year and a half. And so I had this bill of sale, and I did a whole series of research efforts to see what I could find out about him. And he fought in the American Revolution, and through tracking the regiments he was in and the things that happened, I became acquainted with what a brilliant officer Arnold was. I mean, he's just amazing in both, sea battles and land battles. And so after writing this book, Peter's War, which was published by Yale, I got interested in working on Arnold. And it was a real feast as opposed to trying to find information about a very obscure individual who never wrote anything that lasted, but who you tried to kind of fit into the context. So Arnold had all of these letters, including these negotiations with the British, and those were a tremendous help. And I'm really very grateful to all of the scholars who put these things together and put them into print and made it a whole lot easier for those of us. But I should add that I just found that the stereotype of Arnold as a greedy, self-serving, dark man doesn't really answer the question about his life, because he really was the greatest general that we had. He risked his life on endless battlefields. He depleted his fortune paying for his men when Congress didn't. They hadn't paid him for 3 years before he committed treason. So I think there's a much more rounded and interesting and brilliant person. And so it was very exciting kind of learning more about him.
Thank you so much, Joyce. And I kind of want to expand on something that Art had said, and thinking more about your research, because all three of you have done really extensive research on Benedict Arnold. And I'm curious, what surprised you most about Arnold as you were doing your research? And Art started to talk about this a little bit. So I'll start with you, Art, if you want to just expand a little bit more about what you discovered about Arnold at the Clemens Library.
Well, there's many open questions about reasons for Arnold's decisions and actions. One of the issues that I find absolutely fascinating and have really spent quite a bit of time trying to study it, reading what others have discovered, and also through the Clements collection, is the extraordinary decision and behavior that Benedict Arnold made at the Second Battle of Saratoga on October 7th, 1777. Arnold had, previous to that battle, been the commander of the left wing of the American Army, which is the most prestigious command you can have within an army family. He had been very close friends with Horatio Gates, General Gates, in 1776. Gates had been his supreme commander on Lake Champlain, and Arnold, who was fighting Valcour Island, reported to him, and the two of them were very close, very compatible, very mutually supportive. But by 1777, and Arnold showing up at Saratoga, there was a chemistry that had just gone sour. And after the first Battle of Saratoga, Arnold took every comment that General Gates made in any forum as an insult, fed it right back to him, and in open meetings with officers and others, these two guys were absolutely at each other's throat as to the tactics to be followed, who is really in charge, etc. And it got so caustic that Benedict Arnold was stripped of his command, which General Gates had the authority to do as supreme commander, He was restricted to his tent. And Arnold pouted and said, I'm going to leave. I'm going to go to Philadelphia. I'm going to talk to the Congress. I'm going to tell them what a bad guy you are and all of that. And Gates was going, go ahead, be my guest. But it was very clear that this second battle, this decisive potential battle, was going to take place imminently. And there was no way Arnold, the fighting general, was going to leave. And so he was there when this battle took place, not with his troops, but in that tent. And in the height of battle, the battle had raged for some hours already. Arnold got to the point where he couldn't stand it anymore, got on a horse, not his own, a horse he had borrowed from another officer, rode out to the height of the conflict, rode that horse between the two combatants, the Americans and the British and German troops. They were firing right in his line of movement. He gave the appearance that he was invincible, that he didn't care. He just rode back and forth, waving his sword in a frenzy, actually hit a Connecticut officer on the head by accident, but was just screaming and rallying and directing his troops to advance rather than stay in their defensive positions, which was Gates's plan. And in the end, he literally leads the charge up to this Hessian redoubt. He's wounded, his horse is shot out from under him, his leg is shattered, and for him, the war is over. And yet the Americans seized the moment, captured the redoubt, and in the aftermath, the British, as high up as Burgoyne, acknowledged that Arnold's actions probably saved the day for the Americans. So you've got this extraordinary movement against orders, activity and behavior that was totally unsanctioned, unauthorized, that turned out to be hugely positive. Who was that guy? Who was that guy? Now, there's only a very few, really one primary source that I've seen that claims that he was inebriated, that he'd been drinking. That's James Wilkinson. But I'm not sure that that's the explanation. I'm not sure that we're not seeing a madman of an Arnold personality who just couldn't stand not being in the center of that battle. And that's something I'm still struggling to understand and would love to get any thoughts that anybody else has about that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Art. So Joyce, I'll go to you next. You've done a lot of research on Arnold as well. You know, what is one of the things that surprised you the most doing your research?
Could I just quickly answer Art's?
Oh, please. Yeah, please go for it.
Gates was very defensive. He spent the entire battle in his tent where he could not even see the battlefield. When someone came to him asking about reinforcements, they discovered Gates talking to a wounded British officer about the merits of the revolution as this poor man was dying.
Correct.
So I think what amazed me, and then I'll just get to my surprise, what amazed me about Arnold's actions, and I think it's a little unfair to say that the two of them didn't get on because Arnold, in fact, was related and close to Washington, and Gates was not. But what amazed me was that Arnold went out on that field with no official command, and the men followed him. And I can't think of another example where someone did that. He said, if they don't follow me, I will fight in the ranks. And when he got hit in the knee and someone asked him where he was hit, he said, in the leg, I wish it had been my heart. So, I mean, I think someone who does that really is ready to give what he has for his country. But what amazed me was that the soldiers followed him because he was their fighting general. He wasn't sitting in a tent where he couldn't see the battle. And now but just briefly, what amazed me was the infighting between the more radical patriots and the more moderate patriots, which at one point in Pennsylvania actually leads to a shootout between the moderates who were holed up in a house being surrounded by radical militia egged on by the government of Pennsylvania. I mean, I would never have thought that there was this division and that it would actually come to, blows where they were firing at each other. So that's my surprise that I didn't expect anything like that.
That's fascinating. Thank you so much. And then Brian, same with you. What was most surprising to you from your research?
What surprised me the most, I think, was trying to get inside Arnold's head, trying to understand who he was as a person. As historians, a lot of times we study, what happens in legislative chambers or in battlefields or at cultural centers. But there's a line that the 18th century legal scholar William Blackstone has in his famous commentaries. He says, "The only true and natural foundations of a society are the wants and fears of individuals." And as a historian, I like to look at that question. What were the wants, the desires, the aspirations, the hopes and fears that drove individuals to behave the way they did? And what were their fears? What were they terrified of? What kept them awake at night? And I wanted to do that with Arnold. And it started in that 2015 visit to Norwich, probably standing in front of Hannah Arnold's gravestone, and then thinking about what was Arnold's childhood like. And we walked all around town and we talked about what happened in the church and how the father became a drunkard, just fell in society. We'll talk about that later. And what motivated Arnold to be a great battlefield general? What motivated him as a person to become a traitor? And not only to become a traitor, but to lead an army against Richmond, to lead an army against New London, 11 miles downriver from his hometown. That's big stuff that most people don't do, right? So how do I get inside of Arnold's head? And I think, my sense of Arnold is that he wasn't a big ideas guy, right? If he hadn't committed treason, we wouldn't find him sitting next to Madison at Independence Hall, helping to write the Constitution. But there was something that motivated him. I think it was emotional. It was a need to restore a family sense of honor, to recover from childhood humiliation, both on a personal and almost a cosmic level. And we can go into that a little bit later. But what surprised me most is really digging down deep and asking those questions. Who was this man? What were his wants? What were his fears?
That's great. Thank you so much, Brian. So I'm kind of going to dovetail off of what you just said a little bit. And the next question that I have for you all is it possible to reconcile Arnold's patriotism with his treason? And if so, should we be thinking differently about his actions? So I don't know who wants to start with that one, but so is it possible to reconcile Arnold's patriotism with his treason?
Yes.
How about I start with you, Joyce? Go ahead.
Yeah, it's a tough question, but I think it is. I mean, I'm glad that Brian brought up the humiliation of Arnold's childhood, that his father had become a public drunkard and a bankrupt in this small town where everyone would know, where the sheriff came to take their furniture away. So I think that, and he was supposed to go to university and wasn't able to do it because of this. So I think honor was really the most important aspect of his desire as a human being. Honor was the most important thing. And he emphasizes that in the way that he fought and led and all of his activities during the revolution. I think that what made him lose heart was that that he was being humiliated by his own side. There was an increasing number of very tenacious people who were jealous or angry, and Arnold was not one who tolerated people that he disagreed with, that he felt were insufficient. The other thing was that they were constantly after him for money. They had, even on this first expedition that he led through the wilderness of Maine, and then was, they had this unsuccessful attack on Quebec. They were telling him that he needed to account for every penny that this expedition had used, and the guy was wounded and in the hospital and asked for some kind of paymaster, which they never gave him. The money thing goes on and on and on. So and his own money is being depleted. He had a merchant shipping business which was very successful, but when he was fighting the war, his sister was running it. It was not a good time to be running shipping with the British ships out there. She sold everything off. His money was, his whole fortune was being depleted. He was supporting his sister and 3 children. And they were constantly wanting him to come up with this money that he didn't have. And then and even at the very end, they said he owed the Congress 1,000 marks. He was ridiculous. But one other thing about it, I'm just kind of losing my thread here, that his fortune was depleted. But the other thing was that in the context of Philadelphia, where he was in charge of the peace of the place, well, the Americans came back and the British had left. The Pennsylvania Executive Council were really radical, and they sent him a list of over 300 persons who were to be arrested for treason, which he refused to arrest. Everything he did, aggravated them. They drew up these charges against him, some 8 charges, which they published in the newspaper and which they sent to every other governor of all the colonies about how awful a man he was. He was to have a court martial, but it didn't take place for months and months and months while all these charges were out there. And then he was in that conflict between the moderates and the radicals in Pennsylvania. He helped with the moderates and was attacked by these radicals. And he was a cripple as it was. And he asked Congress for some kind of a bodyguard. They said they couldn't do it, but he should just go to the Pennsylvania Executive Council. Well, they were the last people who were going to do anything for him. So, I mean, when you're pursued by all these things, and you feel like you are being dishonored constantly, I think that and ask for money that you don't have, being pursued, I think that gives you reason enough to feel that, there's no honor in staying where you are.
All great points. That's awesome, Joyce. Thank you very much. So then, Art, I'll go to you next on my screen, and I'll just repeat the question. So is it possible to reconcile Arnold's patriotism with his treason? And if so, should we begin thinking differently about his actions?
Well, for many, many years, I did rationalize it. I did point to the injuries and the insults and the hoops that he was being made to jump through. And, he really was his own worst enemy in his personality. He was as contentious as any person in history has ever been. I find I've got this one line that he wrote to George Washington in 1777 after he was threatening to resign his commission because he was not given the seniority that he should have had. And he writes to Washington, who's really asking him to defer his decision to leave the army. He says, "Every personal injury shall be buried in my zeal for the safety and happiness of my country, in whose cause I repeatedly fought and bled, and am ready at all times to risk my life." And I think he, in those years, those first 3 years, you could almost take any snapshot on any day and that would work. What I look at is the correspondence between him and the British. And I see a very different Benedict Arnold. It's not my senses are offended by the way my country. There was no lofty discussion of reasons and philosophy, and after the fact, Arnold wrote a lot about trying to stop the effusion of blood. But in the actual negotiations, it really was very much all about the money. It was, if I do this, can I get this? And assurances from John Andre that he would be rewarded financially. And that negotiation, which I think ultimately led to the failure of the treason plot, it's just tough to think of a guy that could be that honorably disposed, being able to go so radically in another direction. And I find that hard to reconcile.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And Brian, same to you. Last one here for this question.
Yeah, I find it hard to reconcile too, for this reason. And let's start with, imagine this. So Arnold is wounded at Saratoga, and Art did such a great job of describing what that was like. And he's taken to a hospital in Albany, a great big building that had been built during the French and Indian War, had beds for 500, and he stays for 3 months with his shattered leg in a wooden box, in what they call a fracture box. And the doctors wanted to cut off his leg because that's what you would do for a shattered leg. And Arnold refused to let them do it. And he spent 3 months in, extreme pain, feverish. They worried about gangrene. They warned him that they might have to cut it off at any point, but eventually it healed. But imagine lying in bed for 3 months in that condition, getting word of the British surrender at Saratoga. And when an army surrendered, they would erect a great big tent or a bunch of tents. They'd cook a great big meal. They'd cook goose and mutton, and basically the officers would come from both armies and compliment each other and celebrate, the virtue they all showed on the battlefield. And Gates got to do all that, and Arnold got to lie in bed while it happened. So when we talk, like Joyce did, about the humiliation and that quest for honor, I think not only did Arnold feel that he was unfairly deprived of that, which was so important to him, but that, he never walked the same again. He lost part of, he was able to walk, but his leg was a couple inches shorter. What I have a hard time reconciling is then, the way he can turn around and attack New London and Groton. This was a place that was so close to his home. He knew people who lived there. He had done business with people who lived there. And I guess it's just, I think Arnold needed to be a great man. And if he couldn't be a great man on this side, he was going to try to be a great man on this side. Again, because he needed that honor to restore that sense of respectability, to overcome that young childhood humiliation. But it's a little bit outside my realm of experience and imagination to understand how he could have just gone back, go back to New Haven and say, that wasn't working out for me. I'm going to read a few good books and run my shop. But to lead an army against your kind of home region, that's a tough one to imagine. I see Joyce's hand waving.
I know, I'm sorry.
Please go ahead, Joyce.
Yeah, for Art, with the negotiations with the British first, the British kept saying, the reason that money was important to Arnold is if you change sides, you lost all your property. So he lost all his property in America. And he has a sister and 3 sons to support. He's now got a wife who was from a very wealthy family, but he needed some kind of financial security for his family. And what Andre kept telling him was, don't worry, we'll take care of it. We don't need to be specific, but not to worry, it'll all be fine. And when he was just wanting some kind of assurance, I think that would that there would be financial help for him. and for his family if he changed sides. And the other thing I found interesting about these attacks in Connecticut on New London was that once he changed sides, the British gave him a small force to use, and they sent him to the two most difficult places for him to really test him, I think. One was to Virginia, and he was very close to Washington, and Virginia hadn't really been touched. One was to Virginia, and the other was to his home state of Connecticut. So to me, it was their testing whether this man really and truly is on our side or not. So I know it's hard to see how he could do that, but I think that that if he really was going to be fighting for the mother country, these two expeditions were really a kind of test.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And for us being here in Norwich, there's such a strong connection to Groton and New London, and offering different opinions of Arnold as well, between his hometown in Norwich and those in Groton and New London. So thank you for sharing that, Joyce. I think I'm hoping to have enough time for just two more questions, and then we'll open it up to the group to ask questions as well. So my second to last question is going to be kind of a two-parter. It's in tandem. So what do you think the real reason was for Arnold becoming a traitor? And what do you think Peggy Shippen's role was in the treasonous plot? And Art, if it's okay, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I thank you for that. And I think the two questions really are the same answer. I think Arnold went to Philadelphia after he healed enough from his wounds of Saratoga. He's appointed to a sort of a civil command. It's a military command, but it's of a civil environment. He's the military governor of Philadelphia. It couldn't have been a worse assignment for his skill set and personality. And he immediately, I know some of the attacks on him were malicious and poorly motivated, but Arnold also apparently began that career as the military governor with the idea that he was going to make as much money as he possibly could behind the scenes. He was absolutely driven now to generate money. He was buying shares in British-leaning ships. There was a whole series of secret financial activities that really were suspect. And at the same time, his other great motivation was he was looking for love. I mean, his first wife had died 2 years earlier. He had the 3 young boys who his sister was taking care of, but he was clearly, in my mind, driven to find a wife, and he apparently chose 15 and 16-year-old girls as the perfect candidates for that, because he meets one in Boston and immediately showers her with gifts and love letters and proposals and propositions. She turns him down, doesn't even respond. But ironically, when he's in Philadelphia and meets Peggy Shippen, you really could see, it was interesting to me. He literally wrote her some of the same letters that he had written the other woman. I mean, he had made drafts apparently, and the language was exactly the same in terms of the attempt to woo her. And in her case, and it's fascinating to wonder what she saw in Arnold, but she did. He prevailed. He convinced her that he was the man of her dreams. With him, she could be probably loved and rich and powerful and in society. And it's my opinion that at some point, whether it was before they married or on their honeymoon, it's my opinion that on their honeymoon, at least, they began hatching the plan that became Arnold's treason. I believe she was an active co-conspirator. I believe from human nature that Arnold may not have actually ever followed through with a plan like that without having a willing partner and a capable partner. She was a very capable, analytical, strategic person. And I believe they went off on their honeymoon. They talked about their life and their future together and their wants and dreams and hurts. And out of that came the plan to approach the British. And ironically or not, the person they approached, John Andre, was Peggy Shippen's contact. So the concept of whether she knew or was involved, to me, is not even worth a serious discussion. She knew. The more serious question is, did she participate? Was she an active co-conspirator? And I've concluded that she was.
Thank you, Art. And
My
so
pleasure.
Brian, I'll go to you next. Same question.
Sure. I think, again, I don't think for Arnold it was a question of big ideas. It wasn't that the French were getting involved and he was against the French involvement or anything like that. I go back to this. I mean, I go back to his childhood and these humiliations. I mean, on the one hand, right, he's from a respectable kind of upper middle class family, we might call it, the son of a merchant captain. And he gets sent to Cogswell School to prepare him to go to Yale eventually. But then, disease rolls into town and, he loses his sisters. His mother writes him a letter while he's at school, a young teenager, says, Arnold, this happened to your sister, that happened. Prepare yourself for death. Right. That kind of old New England religious fervor, but you need to prepare yourself for death. And I've enclosed a pound of chocolate. It's extraordinary. And then he comes home again with, how does that not damage your faith somehow? Where, to lose your sisters like that, it certainly did something to his father, right? Who goes to become a virulent alcoholic. And, one of the things you showed me in the church membership, right, that they used to pay for a nice, family box at the front of the church. And in a couple of years' time, they were just sitting in the back pews because they couldn't pay as much. And a couple of years after that, they're standing in the back with the poor people. There's that. Again, almost this sort of cosmic humiliation. What has the world done to my family? And then his father's drunkenness. The idea of a 14-year-old boy being sent to pull his old man out of a bar, hey, go get your dad out of the bar and drag him back home. And so just that kind of personal humiliation and a sense that I need to restore honor. I think that's why he's charging across the battlefield, coupled with the humiliations that Joyce mentioned too. He's denied a timely promotion to Major General when he should have gotten that, and all these other financial and other kinds of humiliations. And I think we don't want to underestimate the effect of his injury on his leg. And when we talk about Peggy Shippen, here's a guy who couldn't walk quite right anymore, looking for a second wife. Trying to make himself whole again, both physically and spiritually, mentally. And so I think, again, he needed to be a great man to accomplish that restoration of his own self-worth in his own mind. And if he couldn't succeed at that on the American side, he was going to give it a shot on the British side.
That's great. Thank you, Brian. And then Joyce, I'll let you take it away.
Yes, I think that Peggy Shippen had no part in any kind of plot. She was just a 17-year-old girl. Her family were neutral. They were not loyalists. They were neutral. Her father was very careful to entertain both the British and the Americans. What really persuades me, first of all, the idea that she knew John Andre. I mean, the British officers were all there during the winter. She never had an affair. There have been, 7 books about her, as if she were Eve tempting this man. But she she was not the one that John Andre went out with. It was another Peggy, Peggy Chu. John Andre wrote her one letter from New York saying, "Is there anything I can get you here, lace?" And she writes back saying no. But based on that, there's this idea that somehow this is exactly what a plotter would have replied. But what really persuades me is that she was at West Point with Arnold. He had her come up with their 6-month-old baby, right? And then he ends up disappearing, and the plot is uncovered, and she gets hysterical. But Washington, this is to me the most persuasive point. Washington gives her her choice. She can go into exile with Arnold in New York, or she can go back to her family in Pennsylvania. And she chooses to go back to her family in Pennsylvania, where the executive council has 300 people they're going to try for treason. Now, if she was guilty, I can't imagine her making that choice. She would have just gone. And then in Pennsylvania, the executive council wouldn't let her stay. So after a couple of weeks, even though she said, they could see any letter from him, or she was sent into exile in New York, and her father, accompanied her up to New York. So to me, there's no way that a woman who had been involved in a plot like that would have put herself back into what the London Gazette calls the fangs of the Pennsylvania Executive Council. So that's my piece.
I appreciate the differing opinions. I love it. I think it's great to hear all the different perspectives on that particular issue, because some of the things that I've read clearly say, yes, Peggy's involved. She was involved from the beginning. And as Joyce mentioned, I've seen other things that say, oh no, she was innocent. It was really just Arnold. So I appreciate all three of you having different viewpoints on that. So thank you. I did have one question left, but I think I might just hold off because I want to make sure I get to audience questions as well, because I see that a couple did come up in the chat, and I just want to make sure we have enough time to get to things. So I'm just scrolling in the chat. I don't know if Emily, if you want to help me queue up some questions as well.
Absolutely. I'm more than happy to go through and read the ones that I see.
Okay, perfect. Thank
So
you.
just going back a little bit, of course. So it looks like Pauline asked a question. Do you know why Arnold never took command of the 4th CT, leaving John Durkee to take over?
I don't know if anyone knows the answer to that question, because I actually don't. I'd have to look into that.
You stumped us.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I know Pauline, so I can always touch base with you, Pauline, offline to get you that answer, because I actually don't know, but I do know someone who may know that answer. So so I can connect you later, Pauline.
Absolutely. All right. So Donovan asks, is there evidence of actual patriotism on Arnold's part? That is, did he ever really believe in the American ideal, or is it merely a convenient opportunity for him to gain personal glory?
I always thought it was largely the war was the play that Arnold could participate in. And it's not that I think he cared desperately about his men, certainly early on. But in terms of the concepts and ideas, I think they were convenient. But I agree with my colleague here that Arnold was, I think, driven to a large extent by his childhood and the setbacks that he'd had as a strong, proud leadership guy in amongst his peers, having to go out at night and find his father. And I think that was what we would call today traumatic. And so I think a lot of the actions that I see him take were both militarily correct. They did help the cause, but I can't help but get the sense that they were driven by more personal need. Maybe there's no harm in that if they are helping the the cause that you're espousing and the group you're with is dedicated to. But I always felt a lot of it was patriotism by convenience as opposed to conviction.
Go ahead, Joyce.
No, I think that he obviously felt strongly about the rights of the Americans, and he was involved in the militia in Connecticut early on. I think that if he was just being calculating, it would have been better to be a loyalist. I mean, it looked like the British were going to win. Why risk your life, in some melodrama of your own? I think that that people felt very strongly, and he did too, and about what they were fighting for. And when he wished that he had died at Saratoga, that wasn't, to be a great man. It was that, this was the cause that he really cared about. I think it, time and again, he supported his men, and they loved him because he risked his life. He wasn't sitting back in the tent somewhere saying, go ahead, guys. It's hard to say how many of our great military leaders are great thinkers, but they have a set of ideas that they're willing to risk their life for. And I think that he did.
Well, I totally
Yeah, if I could just add, I mean, we tend to think of the revolution and that period as where all these magnificent ideas are forming and to be put into practice and so forth. But the politics were super messy.
Yeah.
And you could hold those ideas about maintaining the rights of Englishmen and what American independence would mean on the one hand, but you couldn't ignore the messiness of the politics and the things that were being done to Arnold. And so, I think it loses its luster, or in the scales of what's important to you. You've got grand ideas, but you've got these other things that are just messing up your life and your ego that can overwhelm those. So yeah, I think he certainly was a patriot in the early years, but again, in the balance of things, that changes.
All right, fantastic. Thank you. So the next question, Robert asks, weren't the negotiations in code, so long speeches would be out of the question?
The negotiations were in code. And it was quite a complex process where you had to have a particular dictionary and search through it to get the translations. There were Andre and Arnold themselves each had an assistant whose job it was to actually translate the codes or the coded letters into prose. And so it was a very sophisticated exchange of information. And after the first couple of letters, which were written longhand to establish this is who I am, this is what I like to talk about, they quickly decided on a formal code that they continued throughout their negotiations.
All right, fantastic. Next question from Donovan. Is it possible that Arnold's letters to Washington are merely bluster just to get what he wanted?
That's extremely cynical. He was one of Washington's best generals. If you read the memoirs of generals of any modern war, they're all at each other all the time about the problems and the politics and I wasn't allowed to do this or that. I mean, I think Washington really admired him because he could rely on him. And his letters to Washington were interesting to me because most people who've been passed over for a promotion quit. There were a whole lot of officers who quit the Continental Army. When you're passed over for a job, often that's a kind of hint that maybe you should leave. So, but Arnold stayed, and he stayed because Washington asked him to. And I don't think that this was all done, in a cynical way. I mean, it was sort of humiliating to be passed over, but he said as long as he could be of service, he would stay, and he did.
If I
There
could
was
add
a
to what Joyce
mutual,
said. Oh, go ahead, Art.
no, I was going to say that there was a mutual self-interest that I think each man had. Washington did identify Arnold early on as a capable field commander who could get things done as no other commander he had available could. And so he needed him. And so I see him to some extent as Arnold's big brother.
Right.
Deflecting a lot of the flack from Congress, from some of the more aggressive other officers. He protected Arnold and really empowered him to continue to do what he did right through Saratoga. And then even after the Philadelphia controversy, he pulled it out of the civil court, put it to a court-martial forum in a way to try to control and protect the outcome, which he did. And so one of the things that I found most remarkable is that there was a time in the treason negotiations toward the end where Benedict Arnold reported to the British where George Washington was going to be. And I really found that troubling and offensive because he hadn't been asked for that. Nobody said, listen, if you could ever find out where George Washington is and give us access to him, that would really be a big deal. Nobody said that. And so this was Arnold volunteering where George Washington was going to be on a particular date as a way of demonstrating, in my opinion, his value to the British as that part of the treason. And I found that particularly troubling and particularly a window into who was this guy? Was he dark? Was he principled? Was he? And this was one of those things where I read that and I said, wow, this is bad. This is a betrayal of a guy who stood in front of you when people were throwing stones at you and deflected them and really put his reputation on the line for you like a big brother would. And you've just told the British where he's going to be. I just found that hard to take.
Yeah, I would just add, I agree. The relationship between Washington and Arnold is fascinating. And as Joyce pointed out, there was almost this sort of mentoring as Washington, who had no children, he had a relation, with Hamilton and Arnold. I mean, he took care of certain people that he admired what they were able to do. And Arnold was certainly one of those people that he looked out for and that Arnold went to when he was having difficulty with other branches. After he was injured, Arnold, Washington, wanted to help him along so that he could get back to the battlefield. But yeah, as Art points out, when he's about to turn over West Point, Washington is on his way to inspect the fortifications. And there's a reasonable likelihood that depending on when the British acted on the information that Andre was taking back to New York, that they might have captured Washington. And Arnold knew that. And that's one of those things I have a hard time reconciling, because there is a personal relationship there that's just getting kind of thrown under the Revolutionary War era bus.
There's one aspect, however, in which Washington lets Arnold down, and that is that after Arnold is wounded and really can't take the field, he suggests that he be given a sea command. And he would be perfect for that because he had all this experience in sailing and building ships and everything. And Washington won't even consider it. And if that had happened, none of this treason would have happened. It would have given Arnold something to do, a way to sort of recoup his position and some finances if he was a privateer. But for some reason that I don't understand, Washington was intent on his getting back into the field, which he wasn't really physically able to do in any very sensible way. But otherwise, I think that's a very good point, Art.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. The next question is from David. Why did the politicians seem to single Arnold out to disrespect?
Well, if I can jump in, I mean, sometimes it has to do with, not necessarily that they knew Arnold, but people thought of themselves. I live in Pennsylvania now. I don't wake up every morning, look in the mirror and go, damn, I'm a Pennsylvanian, right? And I'm sure you all don't look and say, well, I'm a Connecticut, Yankee or whatever. But then they did. It was, you were a New Yorker, you were a Virginian. This idea of being American is just in its infancy. People like John Marshall come back from fighting in the Continental Army, who goes on to become the great Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and said, before fighting with Washington, before being at Valley Forge, I thought of myself as a Virginian, after which I started to think of myself first as an American. And it'll be a long time before we get everybody on board with that, i.e. Robert E. Lee, for instance. But I think there's an awful lot of state versus state politics. And if Arnold's from Connecticut, well, I want my New York guy in this position. So I'm sure there was some personal stuff too, but I think we have to understand the politics of the era and how people thought of, who should be in charge. It should be Virginians, it should be New Yorkers. What's this guy from Connecticut doing?
Go
Madam
ahead,
Joyce
Joyce.
wants to speak.
I'd just like to add that they didn't like Washington either. I mean, John Adams said that thought Washington was illiterate. He hadn't gone to university, I mean, there was a lot of this kind of jealousy and suspicion. Congress did not trust the army. They kept Washington on a very short leash. They decided all of the officers' ranks. They brought in a whole lot of soldiers of fortune from Europe over Washington's objection. I mean, there was a whole lot of, messy politics. So Arnold was not unique in their dislike. He was not a politician. Washington really suffered fools. Washington was much more carefully diplomatic than Arnold was. But even so, I mean, he put up with a tremendous amount. I think there were all these worries that, a popular general will take over. And one of the letters that I've just read recently that John Adams wrote to Abigail was that he was glad that it wasn't Washington that had won at Saratoga, because if it had been Washington, he would be even more of an idol than he is now. So there was a lot of all of that messy underpinning of the whole thing.
Well, one of the things I've seen with Benedict Arnold, particularly early on when he was on Lake Champlain in 1775, is he didn't get along with anybody. I mean, he was the most contentious guy in the room. I mean, he wanted to be in charge. He had no difficulty looking senior people in the face, larger people in the face, people who brought troops while he was alone. He still demanded with an arrogance that was, hard, contentious. And I witnessed that throughout his, after he was wounded at Quebec and went to Montreal. I mean, he would not let another officer serve above him. I will resign before. I mean, he had these protocols that were pretty odd. And at the risk of probably not having fully worked this out, there's a question here about modern politicians or modern people in the modern stage. I mean, I would probably equate Donald Trump walking into a room and, most people he's getting along with, and a few people are saying they disagree with him, and he's not going to be polite about that. He's not going to accept that constructive criticism. And we all have, and I think Arnold had a lot of that. Don't second guess me. This conflict he had. I mean, there's a whole menu of conflicts from the time he entered the army, went to Lake Champlain, had to negotiate with Ethan Allen, had to negotiate with John Brown, all of whom became, really bitter enemies who filed charges. And so there was not a lot of compromise in him.
All right, thank you so much. I know that we have a couple of questions left in the chat, but just for the sake of time, since we're a bit over and we don't want to hold everybody up, if you have any remaining questions that haven't been answered, please email Regan. She just dropped her contact information in the chat, so we encourage you to send it there. As a closing for myself, I just want to thank everybody so much for attending this evening, and special thanks to the Norwich Historical Society for hosting this program, as well as our panelists who took the time to have a conversation with everybody. And I know that I certainly found it fascinating, and I hope you all did as well. Just on behalf of the Connecticut League of History Organizations, I want to thank all of you once again for attending. If you enjoyed events like this, I encourage you to reach out to me. My name is Emily. I'll drop my information in the chat. We can add you to our contact mailing list, and I encourage you to check out programs like this and events that we host as well. I will just close out by saying thank you from myself and from the league, and I will pass it back to Regan. So thank you so much.
I'll just continue the thank yous and specifically thank my wonderful friends and colleagues, Brian, Art, and Joyce, for their time this evening. It's always fabulous to see you all. So thank you for taking the time. And I just wanted to make a mention that if anybody happens to be local, if you're in the Norwich area tomorrow, please join us for the Lights Out for Benedict Arnold ceremony at 4:30 at Norwich City Hall, and then the Colonial Concert at the Norwich Arts Center directly following the ceremony. And if you want more information about those events, just visit our website at norwichhistoricalsociety.org. So thank you all. Thank you, Brian, Art, Joyce. Thank you.
Thank you, Regan. Honored to be on the panel.
Yes, thank you, everybody. Regan, you guys, Norwich Historical Society does great, magnificent work. I wish every town did a fraction of what you guys do. And it's an honor to be on this panel with Joyce and Art. So thanks so much.
Thank you, guys. And hopefully I can see you all soon in person. Come
Look
for another
forward to
visit.
Absolutely. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good night.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great evening.